Hey, it's Mitchell, and in today's video, I'm going to do an in-depth photo comparison between the Xiaomi Mi A1 and Mi A2. A little bit of background about myself. I've been a photographer for 14 years, shot mostly on Nikon, recently made the switch to Sony, and I'm going to use some of that knowledge I've gained over the years to give you guys some of my analysis on the cameras on these devices. If you're new to my channel, I make videos about tech and the gear I use to create visual content here on YouTube, as well as still photography. So throughout this comparison, I'm first going to do the analysis on the Mi A1, then the Mi A2. I'm shooting this in 4K, so if you want to watch it to go ahead and see as much detail as possible, I would suggest that. So the first image that we have here was shot on the Mi A1. I was entering a cave in the Ninh Binh province of Vietnam. It's one of the beautiful areas of Vietnam that most people come to visit. If we zoom into the photo, we can see that there is some motion blur along the rocks. The Mi A1 does not have an auto HDR function. We can also see that there is a bluish tint on the rocks. It appears like it is from an incorrect color temperature on the camera. We have some blown out highlights, but we have a fair amount of details still left in those blown out aspects of it. Now to move on to the Mi A2, we see less motion blur, significantly less motion blur. The rocks have a bluish tint, but that blue is more reminiscent of the color of the light bouncing up off the water. Now in this instance, the Mi A2 completely blew out the highlights on the deck of the boat, and it's not the most visually pleasing image. Moving on to the next image, I wanted to see how both of these cameras would compare in regards to using their flash. So inside the cave, there's very little lighting, and I used the flash on the Mi A1 and the Mi A2. The Mi A1 completely destroyed the shot, tons of motion blur, blown out highlights. In my opinion, it's an unusable image. When we compare that to the image of the Mi A2, we see that there is significantly less motion blur. The highlights are still blown out, but we do actually have a very nice wood grain that is coming through on the photo for the boat. Now the third image that I have is low light, no flash. We can see the nice little lens flare coming up over my girlfriend's hair in it. But still, if we zoom into this image, there's tons of motion blur, and in my opinion, it's completely unusable. Now the second image shot with the Mi A2, also fair amount of motion blur, but significantly less motion blur than what we had on the Mi A1. The highlights are still blown out, but there is a little bit of detail still preserved in the rocks. Overall, we can see that the pixel binning and the noise are completely destroying the detail of this image. Next image was shot in a temple. Now I wanted to go ahead and show you guys what these cameras looked like in regards to color and color reproduction. Now, the bluish tint that we see on the bottom of these images is the ambient light coming in from the outside. That's why it looks so blue. And if we look up at the detail in the reds and on the Chinese writing of the temple, we can see that a lot of the detail is lost. And the image looks very, very muddy. And the lamp of inside the temple, again, a lot of it is missing. But if we compare that to the image of the Mi A2, we have significantly more accurate color reproduction of the reds in the temple. There is some detail left in the lamp that we can see the shapes of it at least. And in my opinion, this is clearly a better image than what we had on the Mi A1. Now something to note, the Mi A1 does have HDR, but the Mi A2 has an auto HDR function, which at least in my opinion, consistently provides a better image and uses a lot of the artificial intelligence on the device to help create better images. Now, this third image that we have pulled up here, we see the Mi A1 clearly doing a better job than it did in previous attempts. We do have some detail left. We can't read the Coca-Cola on the cans, but you can definitely make out that it is a Coke symbol. And The reds up by the light are definitely a little bit too yellow. The camera was struggling a lot with getting the best white balance. Now, when we compare that with the Mi A2, I don't see a huge difference in these two images. It really comes down to personal preference between them in this specific instance, but the Mi A2 does look marginally better. Now, this image perfectly illustrates the difference in capability with the auto HDR of the Mi A2. I had left HDR on my Mi A1 and we can see that there's tons of motion blur, and in my opinion at least, the image is unusable. When we compare that with the image from the Mi A2, it's clearly a huge step ahead, tons more detail, a lot better dynamic range, almost no motion blur, and we can really see the dual cameras of the Mi A2 being fully utilized and providing more detail, better color, and more light gathering capabilities in this image. Image just of a courtyard with the temple. Now, the white balance of this image has been white balanced for the blues and for the shadows in this, and because of that, all of the greens in the image have a little bit of an odd tint, and the image is just color-wise, it's off. When we compare that with the image shot on the Mi A2, the color balance is significantly warmer. It metered for the sunlight, but still the color reproduction of the greens in the image is fairly accurate, and it's clearly better, although not significantly better. Here was just a quick shot of my friend laying down. This was not shot in HDR. And we do have a bit of an odd green tint on his skin tones. The camera didn't recognize it was shooting skin, and we had the same outcome on the Mi A2. Now here, I wanted to see how much natural depth of field that we were going to get from these two phones just with their respective camera lenses without using any kind of artificial portrait or blurring effect. And the Mi A1 does a great job and really holds up. There's a good amount of texture in the plastic on the water bottle that we can see, and the image has a nice visually pleasing bokeh effect. Now on the Mi A2, the bokeh is even greater and there's more detail preserved in the plastic of the water bottle, and we can see that along with the difference in detail, we do have a slight difference in color, being that the Mi A1 chose the white balance for the shade. The Mi A2 picked more of a daylight white balance. Now here, even though these cameras were set to meter the same way, being frame average metering, we can see that the Mi A1 decided to sacrifice the highlights to maintain the detail left in the shadow. Normally when I'm shooting photos, I will meter for the highlights because it's much easier to bring exposure up out of shadows than it is to recover information, at least from the highlights. And when we compare that with the Mi A2, we can see that their shadows are a lot darker, and we can see that there's more definition and more color accuracy in the greens. Next up, we hiked up to the top of a mountain, and we can see that there is a decent amount of detail, a decent amount of color representation in the Mi A1, but the Mi A1 is still choosing the white balance for the shadows, and it looks a little bit too blue for my taste. When we compare that with the Mi A2, the Mi A2 went ahead and preserved more detail in the sky at the expense of the shadows. Like I said already, shadows can always be brought up. And the overall color temperature is much more daylight oriented, probably shot at around 5500 or 6000 Kelvin. Now, something I would like to note is if we punch in really, really far into the Mi A2, we have a ton of detail left on the landscape down below, the rice fields, the grass, and the sun hitting the pagoda in the distance. I then wanted to compare the portrait modes of both of these cameras, and here we can see that the edge detection on my girlfriend's hair is quite good for a camera at the price point and of the age of the Mi A1. And we can also see that the secondary telephoto lens on the Mi A1 does offer more image compression, and at least to me, as a photographer, is more visually pleasing than the image that I'll show you guys right now of the Mi A2. The Mi A2, because it doesn't have a dedicated portrait lens, uses a wider field of view and there's more left in the shot. And although the background of my girlfriend is completely blown out, we do have some areas in the foreground still not blurred out. And if you guys have ever used a real DSLR or a real interchangeable lens camera, you would know that when you are isolating a subject, both the area in front of and behind the subject is blurred out due to the bokeh of the camera. Overall, I would say that the Mi A2 is a tangible and substantial upgrade over the Mi A1, but I would say if you can get the Mi A1 for really, really cheap, the Mi A1 is still a great camera, but if you're someone that does a lot of travel and prioritizes having a good camera, the Mi A2 is going to be the better option. The auto HDR functionality of the Mi A2 oftentimes does lend itself to visually very pleasing images, and because of the software improvements that we saw to the Mi A1 over the life of the device, I would be really interested to see how much more the camera of the Mi A2 improves in the future, or with the Google Open Camera Flash that can be achieved on the device. Okay guys, it's been Mitchell coming to you from Hanoi. Here's my Mi A1. My Mi A2 is somewhere else. I love both these devices, and I think that Xiaomi has done a wonderful job following up in regards to the camera quality of the Mi A2. And if you guys have more questions or concerns, go ahead and leave them in the comment section down below. And until next time, it's been Mitchell. Peace.